So I'm sorry, that's too long a history of my story.
No, that was great. We'll call that the extended cut.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's
you
fine.
You can cut that out.
Okay, now, can you give me the history of Jerram Bars from birth until covenant in about 30 seconds? Jerram Bars is a storyteller. When I asked him to give me the short version of his bio, he talked for 11 minutes, going back to his father fighting in World War I. He had a lot to say about Elizabeth Mackintosh, too. And he was one of the people we interviewed who knew her before she moved to St. Louis and began attending Covenant Seminary.
Starting with Jerram, and then several other people who were at Covenant Seminary in 1990, we're going to spend this episode hearing more about Elizabeth, what kind of person she was, what she was doing at Covenant, and where she planned to go after. While the crime part of true crime tends to dominate these kinds of stories, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the crime happened to a person with friends and family and a career spanning decades in multiple countries.
So today we're going to focus on the person at the center of the unsolved murder of Elizabeth Mackintosh. This is True Believer, Episode 5, A Strong-Minded Woman. Elizabeth Margaret Mackintosh was born on June 17, 1939, in Vancouver, British Columbia, to Scottish parents. As you've already heard, her father James was later to become the moderator of the Free Church of Scotland and the principal of the Free Church College, but he pastored a church in Vancouver from 1933 through the end of World War II, when his family moved back to Scotland. Elizabeth entered the nursing field at a young age, and according to her sister, she spent some time doing nursing work in a mining community in the Andes Mountains of Peru. She had a connection to Peru because her father spent some time there as the head of a prestigious private school associated with the Free Church. At some point, Elizabeth returned to Scotland to be a full-time nurse, and eventually she moved to London to continue her nursing career. In Episode 1, you heard Diane Preston talk about meeting Elizabeth in England, which eventually led to Elizabeth coming to Covenant Theological Seminary in St. Louis to study counseling. Another person who met Elizabeth in England prior to her coming to America was Jerram Bars.
Jerram, why are we talking today?
We're talking today because we want to remember Elizabeth Mackintosh, who she was, and the wickedness of her being murdered. But yeah, we want to talk about her, we want to remember her, and we pray regularly that her murderer will be discovered and have to come to justice.
Right, and so you knew her in England.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah, Elizabeth came from Scotland. She had been a nurse in Scotland. She was a nurse in Scotland, a very successful one. She came to stay at the English L'Abri, just as I've been saying many, both Christians and non-Christians came. Christians came because they heard about the work and they wanted to sometimes study about, just simply about their faith and to think about what it meant in their particular line of work to be a Christian. So L'Abri was involved in discussing many issues to do with medical care and issues of human life at that point, of abortion, of infanticide, of euthanasia. And Elizabeth was very aware of that because Schaeffer had made this film, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, addressing those issues of human life. So Elizabeth came to stay there. I'm sure that was one of the reasons, as a very deeply committed Christian and being in the medical field herself. My wife chatted with her at some length when she came to stay. So we didn't get to know her well. She wasn't there long because she had a full-time job. So she was there just briefly, but that's when we first met her. And then when I came to teach at Covenant, Elizabeth came to study here.
A couple things to explain there. The Schaeffer that Jerram mentioned is Francis Schaeffer, one of the most influential Christian apologists of the 20th century. In 1948, Schaeffer and his family moved to Switzerland, and in 1955 they founded L'Abri, a sort of spiritual retreat community where people from all over the world would come to discuss philosophy and Christian ethics and all sorts of things. Jerram spent a year at L'Abri in 1967, And Schaefer, who was also an adjunct professor at Covenant Seminary, encouraged Jerram to go study there, which he did. Jerram eventually founded the Francis Schaeffer Institute at Covenant. Elizabeth ended up studying at Covenant, but apparently she was curious about theology and spending time with spiritual people at other points in her life too. Here's Jerram again. Did you have her as a student in any classes?
Yes, I did. Yeah, she would have been in apologetics, and she would have been in several of those classes. Yeah, I would say she's very bright, very serious about ideas. She asked outstanding questions, and she didn't, she was a serious student, so she took her questions very seriously, and she wanted really adequate answers. She wasn't satisfied with just a kind of brush off. And sadly, many male teachers in the churches treat women as kind of second-class students. I would say she didn't suffer fools lightly. Whether that fool was a fellow student or even a pastor or teacher. She said what she thought very plainly. So I think that some men found that a challenge. I'm sure some of her fellow students. I don't remember any of my colleagues finding her a challenge. She was greatly respected and loved by people. But she was serious, and she had strong ideas.
To me, Elizabeth is sort of like the epitome of that problem. She's not the problem, but the way she's been treated is connected to what you just said, right?
Yeah, I have no doubt that whoever killed her, and I have my own ideas about that, but whoever killed her, had a conflict with her as a man. Because here's this woman who has strong convictions, she's a strong person, and she says what she thinks. And if she disagrees, she will say so. And sadly, most men, and this includes men who are pastors or in ministry, don't cope well with anybody disagreeing with them, including other men. But most men have a special problem if it's women who disagree with them or who challenge them and challenge them as equals. And Elizabeth was somebody who challenged people as an equal because she'd clearly been treated with dignity by her own father. And she was certainly treated with dignity coming to L'Abri, and I think most of my colleagues at the seminary treated her with dignity. So I have no recollection of any of my colleagues having any problem with her, being a woman who spoke up.
And a very competent professional nurse.
Yeah, she was very competent. She's a successful person, a human being who'd made a success of what she did, and who lived as a single woman, fulfilled as a single woman. She did not come across as a woman who needed a man to be able to cope with life. She was I won't say self-sufficient, because none of us are self-sufficient. We depended on the Lord. But she was a woman who was comfortable in her relationship with the Lord and her own worth as a human being and her own dignity. And many men find that challenging. I can think of probably in my 34 years of teaching, I can name 3 students who I think were our top students in that time. 2 were male, 1 was a woman, and the woman was just brilliant. Her father was a pastor, just like with Elizabeth, and had treated her with dignity and respect. Here is a woman who's very competent theologically. And I will tell you, many of our male students were threatened by her, which is just tragic. But some of them are threatened by other guys who are brilliant. That's their problem before God. You have to be content with who you are and be glad for other people's gifts.
Jerram mentioned Elizabeth being a single woman who didn't come across as needing a man to cope with life. While that might have been true, Elizabeth's roommate Chris told police that not being married caused some difficulties for Elizabeth. People in her life remembered a few different times where she seemed to feel sad or lonely about being single. About 6 months prior to the murder, 2 people she knew, including her roommate Chris, got engaged. Chris said that Elizabeth cried for a period of time over the announcement because she was happy for Chris, but she was also upset that she was 50 and she very much wanted to be married. Elizabeth said that she had never been able to find the right man for her taste, and she didn't think that she fit the style that men seemed to want either. However, there were some men at Covenant who did seem to be interested in Elizabeth, although she pretty clearly didn't reciprocate their interest. We'll talk more about that in a future episode. Here's Skip and Bonnie Dusenberry, who knew Elizabeth from Covenant and from Providence Reformed Presbyterian Church.
She showed up the first year you were at...
Well, I don't know if it was my first year. No, it would have been my last year because she died that spring. Right. So I was there for 3 years.
She was there too.
She started in the fall of '88.
Okay,
Right.
well, I guess it was my second year then. And I don't remember if it's when we met for the first time. It may have been. There was a room that was kind of like a small student union. Covenant in those days was not that big. It's a lot bigger now than it was then. And I was sitting at a booth, and she walked up and introduced herself. I think maybe we'd been in a class together, and I don't know if I'd made a comment in class that, she was interested in. So anyway, that's how we met and began to talk. And we're both Anglophiles, as a lot of Americans are, and so the fact that she was from the UK, even though she was Scottish, not English, we sat down and I just remember enjoying getting to know her about her background.
And then she gradually became a family friend. She ended up going to the same church. We picked her up every Sunday morning. We brought her back.
Yeah, she rode to church with us typically, and then we brought her back and dropped her off.
And then we'd pick her up for Sunday evening, and the same thing. She ended up babysitting our children, spending a whole weekend with them. Things like that. We just got to be very close friends.
Because we live very close to the seminary, so logistically, again, it was a convenient situation.
Right. She was very cheerful, very grateful, very spiritual. She shared a lot with us. Of course, we were very interested in Scotland, and she gladly related Scottish stories and from her family's croft. And her father was the head of the theological school, right?
Yeah, the Free Church College.
And then she had also had lived in England before she came to St.
that's
Louis.
where she had come from. She'd been living in England for some time,
Right.
I think.
So we connected with her on that. And she was just a dear friend. I remember she was very excited about turning 50. I guess that was if she came in 88, she turned 50 in 89, June 17th of 89. And she was very excited about her Jubilee year and canceling all her debts and stuff like that.
Do you remember if you had a birthday party or what did she want to do for her 50th?
She was back in Scotland with her family, with her folks.
During the summer.
The summer.
Yeah.
But she was very sweet to our children and very interested in each one of them. We have four. And, would come over and play card games and have family nights with us. And she was just a wonderful addition. Well, she was a really great person to be around.
She was very
cheerful.
Delightful. One other thing I would add, and it's a word that might be taken in a wrong way. I mean, opinionate, strong-minded, I would say. Mm-hmm. She was a woman of strong opinions. Convictions, yeah, in a good sense of the word. She knew what she believed about a lot of things, and strong-minded again, but not in a bad way, I think. I mean that as a positive thing.
You referenced her as a very spiritual person. Obviously, she was going to seminary. Do you have any memories of how she would talk about her faith or topics that were of interest to her?
Well, she was very interested theologically. Her father had been the dean of the theological school, or the
principal. The title that they had for the head was the principal of the Free Church College. Yeah.
And she would give us background stories of her parents' godliness and her life as a single woman in the church. Yeah, I just
Well, and I think, again, this is a general impression. It's not based on specific conversations, but I think she referenced the Lord in a very personal kind of way. She would talk about the Lord in a sense that he was real to her in her life, not just an abstraction,
right.
you know.
It wasn't just theological
So
knowledge.
again, I mean, that's one of the things that I think about. I think she would share things from the Word that she had read that had spoken to her in a personal kind of way.
Is there a favorite story that you like to tell about a time when Elizabeth was over at your house or hanging out with you?
She gave us the tartan snap game. It was a matching game with tartans, and you lay it out, and then you have to remember where it is and match them up, and that's still in our family, and the kids love it. And now their kids are playing tartan snap. So I just remember she would come over, and we would just have popcorn
Yeah, I
and
mean, she was
hot
just
chocolate and family night and play games. And I think it was a great fit. She loved us and our kids and us, and we loved her. And we were new to St. Louis. We didn't know a lot of people. And, we were at the same church, and it was just a natural, easy friendship.
Next is Chris and Marilyn Baker, who you've also heard in past episodes. But here, you're going to get to know them a little bit more, including Chris talking about his dilemma over whether to do an interview with us in the first place.
I debated about whether I was going to do it. Do I really want to be involved in resurrecting this conversation? But then I thought, it can't hurt anything. All we need to do is share our memories. We're not trying to solve anything, just share our memories of Elizabeth. And I thought, well, that could be very helpful. It could be, to give some sense of even how we responded to her and to the whole situation. So I thought, why not? My name's Chris Baker. I grew up... Alias Carl C. Baker Jr. Yes, that probably would help, wouldn't it? I've gone by Chris for I don't know how long. Grew up north of Chicago, about 40 miles. When I was finishing up my master's degree, I got this sense of call to the ministry, and that wound up being put on hold for about 10 years. In the course of time, I ran a sewing business, a manufacturing business for about 7 years, working very closely with people of the production line. And finally, after about 7 or 8 years of doing that, I thought, you know what, it's now or never. I've got to go to seminary. And thought, if we make the change now, it'll be easier than waiting even 2 more years or 3 more years. So we came here in 1988, summer of 1988 for summer Greek. I was 38 years old at that time.
37.
What?
We were 37.
We were 37. I told you, see?
Says the boss.
If I say something, Marilyn will correct me because I'll either exaggerate, overstate, or miss the point altogether.
We weren't the oldest people at
We've been
seminary.
married 50 years, so you can get away with that.
So how did you first get connected to Elizabeth? Was it through covenant or through providence?
In my case, I met her through providence, attending church, attending worship with her. I didn't really have any classes with Elizabeth. Our academic paths didn't cross in that way. I was a Master of Divinity student. I think Elizabeth was a counseling student. And at that time, even her basic classes, her fundamental classes, would not have overlapped with mine. So most of the interactions I had with her were at Providence Church, or just then occasionally on campus when we'd cross one another's path in the library, get into conversations.
Okay, so it's really exciting to get to talk to you guys because you are the first ones we've interviewed who personally knew Elizabeth. And everything we've heard about her up to now has been second and third and fourth hand. So what was she like? What was your experience of her?
Well, she was very sweet and very tender, and she, I don't know if anybody has talked about this, she was a nurse before when she came over from Scotland. I think she actually came over from England, but she was of Scottish descent. And she had been a nurse for many years over there and came over to the United States and worked at I believe it was Mercy Hospital, which I don't think it was called Mercy back then.
The St. John's.
St. John's.
Right across the street.
And she realized she could not work there because of the green card situation. And so she had to return all the money to there. She lived in the basement of Brian Chappell's house there on Conway and the Outer Drive with another girl named Chris, who was a student. And she started cleaning the buildings. They gave her tasks like that. I think when you're an international student, that's what you can do. You can work at the seminary, but you can't work in an outside job and make money. And so she would leave notes on, like, people's desks, just like little Bible verses and sweet notes, have a good day. And, you know, the shocking thing when this happened to her was nobody hated her. There was nobody. She was very, very lovable, very friendly.
She really was a lovable person.
9 days before she was murdered, we had just gotten back the night before she was murdered from Chris's dad had died unexpectedly. We had traveled to Florida. And when his dad unexpectedly passed, Chris was actually in Chicago, and David Weinkauf called Elizabeth up and said, "Get over to Marilyn, Chris's apartment. She's going to need you to take phone calls." We had 2 kids. I had to tell the children that their grandfather had died. And she was just wonderful. The funny thing I remember, though, she made me tea like she would an English person, and she put milk in it. And that was not very good. She took all the phone calls. People at Providence were trying to figure out how to get Chris back from Chicago. Somebody wanted to fly him home. I said, it's just best if he drives home. And then we headed to, somebody at the church lent us a car to get to Florida. And we came back the day before she died. And we saw her at church that night because we had evening worship. So we saw her. But she was just very tender. She was opinionated, you know, but she was not disliked by anybody.
I could describe it as Scottish, strong-willed. Mm. She knew what she thought. She studied, so she would state her case, stand her ground. And while she might do that, the character of how she came and provided tea for Marilyn and did phone calls for her and that sort of thing when Dad died is, I would say, also very typical and characteristic of Elizabeth. She really was a servant. She saw opportunities to serve, and she stepped right in, and she would do it.
Yeah, and she was never had been married, but she really loved families. You know, many families in the church. She just loved on us and their children, even though she wasn't their mother.
One of the things that we've always heard about Elizabeth is that she was in the counseling program. But as I understand it, the counseling program as it is today at Covenant didn't actually exist in 1990. So can you speak to what she was actually doing there, and then what was she hoping to do when she left Covenant?
Covenant really was known for its strong emphasis on covenant theology and how that worked out in life. Jerram Bars, in my opinion, was the one guy who was clearest about the expectation that we're to be living out our Christian faith with this consistent worldview and reaching others with this consistent worldview. I think that that's what attracted Elizabeth. It's true that we didn't have the counseling program that the school has today was, if anything, in sort of germinal form when I was going through my Master of Divinity. So there were classes that were very similar between the two curriculum, but then there would be an emphasis in counseling, just like there was an emphasis in exegesis or an emphasis in theological studies. Now those are identifiable tracks, but then I would say that they were in germinal form. So she would have been taking, I took 2 counseling classes just in my pastoral track, but she would have taken all the available counseling classes, or at least all of the variations that were taught. So she was getting the master's degree with the counseling emphasis.
Yeah, and there was probably maybe 6 women on campus at that time. I mean, it's not the campus that it is today. There was not very many women.
Who are enrolled in the seminary.
Correct.
On campus.
Correct.
I would say
Right.
that's accurate. Six max.
As it turns out, at that time there were only 2 women enrolled at Covenant who also lived on campus, Elizabeth and her roommate Chris, at least according to the Covenant student directory for that year. All the other women who lived in the campus housing were wives of Covenant students or staff. One other thing to clarify here, it was only recently that we got a hold of a copy of an interview with Elizabeth that was published in the fall 1989 edition of Inside Covenant Seminary, a newsletter published by Covenant. I had known about this interview for years, but had a hard time tracking it down. That's been part of the treasure hunt of working on this series, and it's kind of hard for me to describe how exciting it was to finally hold this interview in my hands. Anyway, in that interview, Elizabeth says she originally planned to study for a 1-year graduate certificate, but after her first semester at Covenant, she transferred to the 2-year MA program with a concentration in biblical counseling. According to the article, she would have been the first student ever to graduate from Covenant Seminary with that specific degree. What about post-Covenant? Was she planning to go back to Scotland, or did she talk about what her plans were?
Yes, that was pretty clear to me that she intended to go back. She wanted to carry that training back into her life back there. So I didn't get any sense at all that she intended to stay here.
According to that same newsletter interview with Elizabeth, after Covenant, she was hoping to pursue a new career in biblical counseling, and she believed that her prior career in nursing would be helpful for that, although she doesn't specifically say where she hoped to do it. God has allowed a number of loss experiences in my life, she said, which have taught me some valuable lessons in terms of seeing the need to empathize with others. I'm thankful that God is using Covenant Seminary to equip me and others for the task of His service. Marilyn, I want to go back to something that you said earlier. You talked about how there was nobody on campus who didn't like Elizabeth. But we also know about Michael on the house cleaning staff and their interactions and these memos that they were writing back and forth.
Right.
And it seems like they didn't get along very well.
Right.
So how do you square those two things?
Well, I think, like myself, being of Scottish descent and can be pretty feisty.
Oh my goodness.
Maybe Elizabeth came off, and it was like the icing on the cake for him. He wasn't getting a recommendation for school, and I know at a certain point he was a pastor of some different churches because people told us, and they ran into him in wherever, California and Pennsylvania and wherever he went. But, I mean, there's always somebody who's going to irk you. There's people who you're just not going to meld with. And their personalities were different personalities. Elizabeth was happy about life and happy about things and wanted to be cooperative. And whether she wrote that letter and sent it to Tom, who we also knew because Chris worked at the seminary.
She was happy. She wanted to go about life. Mm-hmm. But she knew what she thought, and
Right.
she would stand her ground,
Right.
too. That troubles some people.
Right. And she was older than most of them. She was 50 years old.
Yeah.
You know, I would say, I don't know what the average age was in seminary back then, but it wasn't our age. We brought the average age up, you know, so at 37.
Yeah.
But she was older, so she could ask for respect because some of the people were in their 20s. She could have been their mother.
She also already had a career.
Right.
You know,
right.
she's a nurse.
Right.
She chose to lay that aside in order to enhance what she understood and gain some training. The Scottish part is, you know, it's important that we don't discount that. There's a certain temperament.
Yeah.
And so there's this resolve and this sometimes fierceness. But that didn't eliminate the servant's heart and the sweetness when she really saw other people in need.
Right.
So
We did not have any run-ins with Elizabeth, and maybe we were blind to it, you know.
I'm trying to think if I ever had an argument with Elizabeth. I mean, about anything.
Yeah.
I really can't recall any time that I had an argument per se.
For many years, as I got more and more interested in this case, one of the biggest mysteries was around Elizabeth herself. Who was she? What was she like? Other than her being from Scotland and a few other minor details from newspaper articles, we knew almost nothing about her, meaning people like myself who have gotten interested in the case over the past few years. Here's Ruth and I talking about some of those things that we wondered about Elizabeth.
Yeah, so as we started talking to people about Elizabeth, we heard a lot of the standard things that you hear from a former friend. She was a nice person. Here's what I liked about her. But there was also an undercurrent that sometimes she was kind of hard to be around. And we wondered a little bit about whether that was just her personality or whether that was maybe a factor of being an older woman with a career at a theologically conservative seminary. And so it's been interesting to kind of parse through what was her personality versus what was the environment at Covenant.
It seems to be both. She was definitely in... Well, one of the contradictions about Elizabeth that's so interesting that we're trying to explore is that not only was she in this conservative environment, but she actually kind of flourished in that environment, and that was the environment that she preferred.
Yeah, there's no indication that she felt repressed. She seemed to enjoy that, theology and culture. Okay, I guess this is where I would go into my deep dive of feminism, though, of you don't have to believe in feminism to be repressed by a patriarchal society, but we don't need to include that.
Do you want to try it and we'll just see what happens? Or maybe I'll just include that what you just said.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't have much more to add. But then, again, right, as we talk to people, we got a much clearer picture, which is what happens. That's the benefit of talking to people. People said they loved her. People said she had a servant's heart. People said she was always quick to watch their kids and help out with dinner and help people study. But there were some people who did have a hard time getting along with her. And that's true too.
In episode 3, we talked about Elizabeth's nursing job in England, how she was fired by a person who was previously her subordinate, and the effects that incident seemed to still be having on her even while she was at Covenant. I recently got a chance to speak with Richard Winter, who came to Covenant in 1992 and taught there for over 30 years. He was brought in to revamp their counseling program, and he's responsible for turning that program into what it is today. You'll hear more from and about him in this and future episodes. But here, I want to play you some thoughts he had about Elizabeth's possible mindset in the aftermath of being fired from her nursing job. One thing, though, Richard lives in England now, and we had seemingly endless technical difficulties trying to get this interview recorded. The audio quality's less than ideal in some places, but it's the best we've got.
I was reflecting on the things that you turned up earlier on in the podcast, and Elizabeth's background coming from a nursing, a sort of the hierarchy of nursing in a British hospital. And there was a hierarchy at that time particularly. So to be a sister or a head nurse was a pretty important position. And for her to lose that job and to be in conflict with someone and to be, it sounds like, pretty traumatized by what happened to her and the loss of her job, and then to find herself cleaning toilets in the seminary, that was a total sort of turning her on her head, and must have been a very shameful, sort of internally quite a shameful thing. So she would probably be carrying quite a lot of anger, shame, sadness, grief, and sense of injustice, perhaps, within herself that perhaps hadn't been talked about, resolved. So that the sort of relational situation she stepped into with the supervisor, that was a particularly difficult one, and a particularly inflammatory one. And I guess with anyone who crossed her, it could have been. yeah, it's something that just made me wonder about how she was dealing with all that she had been through. There's also the cultural differences, which are pretty huge. So a Scottish culture is very different from a Midwest culture. And so some of the understandings of communication can get pretty messed up. And I found it, in some ways, the cultural differences quite difficult. My wife, who comes from Boston, so she was a New Englander, she found the culture of the Midwest very different again from her experience in England. So I think that all of that needs to be taken into account as well, how it affected her.
You've already heard a lot about Elizabeth's relationship with Michael, her supervisor on the house cleaning staff at Covenant. In addition to his own difficulties with Elizabeth, Michael told police about an incident between her and another man who worked at Covenant named Wallace. According to Michael, in the spring of 1989, Elizabeth switched to cleaning and vacuuming the administration building in the evenings instead of early mornings like the chapel. But sometimes Wallace worked in that building in the evenings, doing phone calls and things that required quiet, and he didn't want Elizabeth in there around that time. Michael said that Wallace was already a high-strung person and that he was probably gruff with Elizabeth about it. But it's possible that more was going on under the surface there. Wallace had previously dated a woman that Elizabeth was friends with, but Elizabeth didn't approve of that relationship, and it ended badly. In his interview with police, Wallace didn't specifically mention that connection to Elizabeth, but he did say that she was hard to work with and was somewhat of a loner who liked to do things her way. He felt like she was really nice, she was just someone who was a little bullheaded, as he called her. At the time of the murder, Elizabeth lived with her roommate, Chris, but at some point prior to that, a third woman named Terry also lived with them, and she told police that she didn't get along with Elizabeth very well. She said Elizabeth was a spunky person and a go-getter, but could also be confrontational. Another woman who worked at Covenant and was close friends with Elizabeth said that she and Terry would get into shouting matches. It's never mentioned in the report when Terry moved out, but at the time of the murder, she was living in Florida. A woman named Barbara, who worked as a library assistant at Covenant, told police about an incident that happened a couple weeks before the murder. She overheard Elizabeth having a verbal altercation, as she described it, with a man named George Johnston, who at the time was filling in as the interim library director. Barbara said that the argument was about lost and found property on campus, with Elizabeth telling George that he needed to fix the lost and found situation immediately, whatever that means. Barbara said that this type of behavior was very uncharacteristic of Elizabeth, and that she felt like Elizabeth owed George an apology. In George's interview with the police, he never mentions the argument. There's more to say about George Johnston, Wallace, and some of the other men that Elizabeth interacted with on campus, but we'll talk more about them in a future episode. Here, I think it's worth saying that over the course of anyone's life, there's going to be fights and disputes and arguments and breakups. We're not sharing any of this to cast blame on anyone or on Elizabeth. The police that conducted these interviews apparently never felt like there was anything in these interactions that might point to a suspect or a motive in her murder. Now I want to switch gears and talk about the counseling work that Elizabeth was both studying and performing, because it sheds a lot of light on her as a person and some of the cross currents at Covenant and in the PCA at the time. I know this might seem like an irrelevant non sequitur, but I promise it's important to understanding more about Elizabeth and about the context of what she was up to in 1990. As you've heard several times already, the counseling program at Covenant changed rapidly after 1990, due in large part to the work of Richard Winter. Originally from England, Richard worked with Jerram Barrs at the English L'Abri, and it was Jerram who convinced Richard to make the move to Covenant in 1992. It's interesting that Richard would have been at the English L'Abri during the time that Elizabeth visited, which you heard Jerram mention earlier, although he doesn't remember meeting Elizabeth while she was there. Here he talks about Covenant's counseling program prior to his arrival and then the changes that he put in place.
It was a little bit hit and miss, I think. They had one person who was a fairly eclectic but Christian counselor, working for a while. And then they took on a nouthetic counselor, who was someone who had studied under J. Adams and espoused a nouthetic view, which was basically a sort of Bible-only type of counseling with a real focus on people's individual sin and a lack of interest in the secular psychology, feeling that was just not useful at all. And so that was the sort of background, I think, before they asked me to come there, because I think they were somewhat dissatisfied with what they had. Well, one of the things they wanted me to do was to develop a state-certified counseling program. So that meant that we had to find out what the state requirements were, and we had to try and make our courses fit with those while retaining a strong biblical background to everything that we did. But the main differences were that my understanding, or I guess, took in a view that there was a lot to be learned from secular psychology under the umbrella of common grace, or common grace wisdom, as I came to call it. So there were many things in the psychological world that we could learn and use when helping people with struggles like depression and anxiety and grief and so on. So we could learn there was common ground between Christian and non-Christian there. And that was something that the nouthetic counselors did not want to do. And as I said, their focus was very much on the individual sin, whereas our focus was on how people have sinned, for sure, but how they have also been sinned against by others and wounded by them, and how they were reacting to the ways in which they had been sinned against. And helping them to grieve those things and to come to terms with them. But they called themselves biblical counselors. Well, we were biblical counselors too, but we had a more sort of open view to exploring the common grace wisdom side of the secular world. And we found it actually quite fascinating to do that, and gave us a sort of apologetic position to speak to non-Christians about the place of psychology and the Bible in our world. And the other factor, too, was that the nouthetic counselors did not like to encourage people to use medication. And coming from a psychiatric background, obviously, I had been trained in the use of medication for things like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and so on. So I saw that there really was a place, especially in the most extreme disorders, and would encourage the students to encourage their clients to get a medical evaluation, and if necessary, that they should be using something like an antidepressant. We knew that antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications were being used probably too much, but there is still a place for them. So those are the sort of main differences, I think. And so I spent a lot of time teaching the students how to evaluate secular psychology from a biblical perspective, to discern what was true, what we could agree with in it, and to discern what was untrue and what we would disagree with and could not use.
As we've mentioned before, Paul Koistra became president of Covenant Seminary in 1985. Part of the changes that he instituted eventually included taking their less formal, biblical-based counseling program and turning it into a legitimate master's program. And it's not coincidental that these changes brought in a massive influx of students through the 1990s, including many more female students than Covenant had ever had. But Elizabeth was there before a lot of these changes took place. And the nouthetic style of counseling that Richard described seemed to fit Elizabeth's personal style, given what those who knew her have said about her. As part of her training at Covenant, Elizabeth did some counseling with patients at Missouri Baptist Hospital, or MOBAP as it's called in St. Louis, which is located very close to the Covenant campus. She was supervised at MOBAP by Dr. Eugene Holman, a psychiatrist connected to Covenant. As we were researching for this series, Holman's name came up in connection with several of this story's characters. For example, according to public documents, he was the psychiatrist that treated Mark Bells during several of his mental health relapses over the decades. We'll talk more about Holman's connections in future episodes, but the thing that's important right now is how he assessed Elizabeth as a counselor. He told police that she was serious in her attempts to help the patients, but that her counseling style may have actually caused more harm than good. He said she was strong-willed and that she had trouble identifying the patient's true deep depression. She would treat a superficial problem, but not recognize the deeper-seated problems. This would only cause the patients more anxiety because they were under treatment, being told how to fix their problems, but not really feeling any better. I know this is overly simplistic, but that's essentially nouthetic counseling. Feeling depressed? Read the Bible and do what it says. Still depressed? You're not following the Bible enough, or trusting that God can heal you. Or maybe you still have some kind of sin in your life that's keeping you in a state of depression. Needless to say, this style of counseling is pretty controversial outside evangelical Christian circles. And it seemed to be controversial enough inside Covenant that they radically transformed their own program. The last person I want to talk about for now also ties in with this tension over what you might call Covenant's theory and practice of counseling prior to Richard Winter's changes. A woman named Ruth, not my co-producer, met Elizabeth about a year before the murder at Epiphany Episcopal Church, which Elizabeth would occasionally visit. Ruth was also a practicing psychotherapist. Just 2 days before the murder, Ruth invited Elizabeth to her house for lunch. The two don't seem to have been that close, but Ruth's son was about to take a trip to England, and they wanted to hear Elizabeth's opinions about what he should see and visit while he was there. Elizabeth didn't have a driver's license, so Ruth picked her up from Covenant and brought her back to the house for the lunch date. But on the drive there, the two started arguing about Covenant's counseling program. Ruth told Elizabeth that she should broaden her training and possibly take some classes at a different school. As it turns out, Elizabeth was taking classes at another school, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. Later, Ruth told police, although presumably she also said some or all of this to Elizabeth, that Covenant's view of counseling was to aggressively attack people's problems. They also believed that anger was a sin and that it was not to be dealt with. Again, this is very much in line with a nouthetic style of counseling, which Ruth and Eugene Holman seem to have very much disagreed with. Ruth also said some apparently unflattering things about Dr. George Knight, a former Covenant professor with whom Elizabeth was very close. She had spent 2 weeks that January with Dr. Knight and his wife at their home in Florida. We'll talk more about Dr. Knight in just a few minutes, but for now, the main point is that Ruth's criticism really upset Elizabeth. She felt like Ruth was sharing things that should have been held in confidence because Ruth was a practicing psychotherapist, and Elizabeth was also very defensive about Dr. Knight and Covenant. So they got to the house for the lunch date, and according to Ruth, everything was fine. But as soon as they got in the car to head back to Covenant, Elizabeth became upset again. Ruth told police that Elizabeth could be very confrontational with people about different ideas and beliefs that she held. She said that this type of personality and behavior, when mixed with explosive behavior, could create problems. Shortly afterwards, Ruth got a call from a mutual friend who said that Elizabeth was upset by the conversation they had had, and apparently Elizabeth had been talking to multiple people about it. Ruth said that as far as she was concerned, she and Elizabeth were still friends, they just had different opinions about certain things. So, what do we make of all this? Here's Ruth, my co-producer, not the psychotherapist.
Elizabeth seems complicated. She had strong convictions. She was outspoken. What do you think she would want people to know about her, and what does that make you think about this case?
As we've been working on this, and as I've sort of gotten to know Elizabeth better through research and hearing what people have said about her, it's made me think about what would people say about me if I was tragically murdered and there was a huge police investigation and dozens of people told stories about me. It's like, what would it be like if you could be a fly on the wall at your own funeral? And I think what's going on is that when all these people are talking to the police, they're trying to be as helpful as they can because they want to help solve the murder. So they're telling stories about Elizabeth that are going to help with that. And so, all these people who have these run-ins with Elizabeth, or they got into an argument with her or whatever, almost all of the people who talked about those things also said really positive things about her. But it's almost like the positive things aren't going to help solve her murder. So they're trying to find any little thing. Oh yeah, we had this one interaction, or she said this one thing, or anything that's probably more negative that could be a reason why she got murdered or something like that. And so it's not like all of these things add up to, well, all these people had bad things to say about Elizabeth. It's more like they're trying to help out. And so those things don't represent the totality of who she was. And so anyone who has their whole life and personality picked apart by dozens of people in the wake of a tragic event, everyone's going to have a mixed bag of positives and negatives. And so basically she was human. She was a person like everybody else.
Yeah. It's natural after someone dies to try and think of the most positive things to say. But the police are asking, well, did she have any enemies? And so that brings out the negative stories, right? But like you said, neither one would be a full representation of her life. We've talked too of what would we want people to say about us. I hope people would say good things, but it probably wouldn't be accurate if they only said good things. So we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect. Exactly.
Now I want to circle back to George Knight, the former Covenant professor, and an issue at the seminary that we've touched on briefly in other episodes. Here's Diane Preston.
Liz came from a very conservative background. She ended up at Providence, which matched the very conservative background. One of my best friends was good friends with Liz, and we were talking about it in the last day or two. Apparently, Liz was considering transferring to Knox Seminary and had gotten an application because Knox was a little more conservative than Covenant. Okay, Knox was a lot more conservative. Covenant was conservative. Knox was far right. And she was considering going there. So I think she'd been a nurse for a long time. She wasn't married. And I think she was looking for a new avenue of service and wanted training for it.
Knox Theological Seminary was founded in 1989 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, by televangelist D. James Kennedy, the pastor of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. The founding of Knox came at a perfect time for George Knight, because the way he described it in his police interview in 1990, he was part of a group that was essentially pushed out of Covenant. He said that he had basically been pressured to leave because of some of the differences with the new president, Paul Koistra, and that there was a real split between Koistra and several of the older professors around certain theological issues. At that time, George Knight was considered one of the foremost New Testament scholars among evangelicals. He also convinced Covenant professor Dr. Robert Raymond and Dr. Joseph Hall to leave Covenant and join them at Knox. In the police report, there's an interview with a woman named Marion who went to Providence Church with Elizabeth. Actually, Marion was the woman who told Ruth that Elizabeth was upset about their lunch date conversation on March 24th. Anyway, Marion told police that there were political differences at Covenant, and that Elizabeth was on the side of George Knight, and that she believed Dr. Knight was more or less shoved out by the more liberal faction on campus. There's a few reasons why we think that this Covenant-Knox split is important to Elizabeth's story. First, and you heard me reference Mark Bell's talking about this in the last episode, it's apparent in all the police documents that they did not understand the nuanced political dynamics going on at Covenant and in the PCA at the time of the murder. Repeatedly throughout the police reports, they refer to Covenant as being more conservative and having issues with a faction of more liberal professors and administrators. But it was exactly the opposite. Now, this might seem like an unimportant detail having nothing to do with Elizabeth's murder, but as we've mentioned before, Elizabeth was transferring to Knox Seminary. Her plan was to go down to Florida in the spring and do an internship at Coral Ridge, where George Knight and his wife now attended. On March 23rd, just 3 days before the murder, Elizabeth spoke to Dr. Knight on the phone to get the phone number of another couple that she was going to stay with when she came down there. She had to call him back the next day when it turned out that the phone number he gave her was wrong. Then, for that fall, Elizabeth had been accepted to take some classes at Knox. One of the only pieces of physical evidence found at the murder scene was her Knox acceptance letter, dated March 14th, which was written by Dr. Knight. Here, I'll quote the first paragraph. "Dear Elizabeth, I'm very happy to inform you that you have been accepted as a special student taking Inspiration and Interpretation with Dr. Robert Raymond, and any other courses you might wish to take, as a transfer course towards an MA at Covenant Seminary. I'm delighted to have you be a part of this important, historic first class of students at Knox Theological Seminary." Unquote. There's also a handwritten note from Dr. Knight at the bottom of the letter that's very hard to make out, but it seems to reference a woman named Joyce who sent Elizabeth a separate letter. So it's not that Elizabeth was leaving Covenant, per se. She was going to take some courses at Knox, which apparently counted towards her master's degree at Covenant. In her diary, she also wrote about plans to return to St. Louis after she finished her internship, and several people confirmed that this was her plan. Just a quick side note here. Ruth and I reviewed some sermon notes and a day planner that she kept. Almost every day in her calendar included notes about prayer, scripture, Bible studies, church services. She wrote notes about people she wanted to check in on and talk to. She noted days when a friend was visiting from out of town. In sermon notes, she wrote about removing resentment and finding joy and inspiration from God. That's where we got the name for this series. The phrase true believers appears several times in the sermon notes that she took. On a personal note, it was pretty surreal for me to physically hold Elizabeth's notebooks in my hands while I was sitting in this tiny little interview room at the Creve Coeur police station. I've spent most of my waking hours the last couple years thinking about Elizabeth, so to physically have some connection with her was much more impactful than I was expecting. And it really brought home the reality that this was an actual person who actually lived. Anyway, back to the Knox transfer. There's conflicting accounts of how the higher-ups at Covenant felt about Elizabeth going down there. Her friend Marion told police that the Covenant administration didn't have a problem with it. But George Knight told police that some of the Covenant administrative heads were not happy with Elizabeth's decision to go to Florida to study and work with him. The police report indicates that other people also said that Covenant administrators were unhappy with Elizabeth going to Knox. We also have something from Elizabeth herself that indicates how the administrators may have felt about her going down there. About a week before the murder, she filled out a prayer request form for a Covenant newsletter. On the form, Elizabeth says that she's transferring to Fort Lauderdale, Florida from June to December 1990 to undertake a counseling practicum at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. On the next line, in parentheses, she adds that she also hoped to take courses at Knox Theological Seminary. Then, at the very bottom of the page, she added a note that said, "We'll understand if Ben does not like this bit," with an arrow pointing back to the line about Knox. Ben was Covenant's director of development. Now, it seems like Elizabeth wrote that note as a joke. She had that kind of playful sense of humor. But it's not totally clear how much truth might have been behind that joke. Okay, I'm going to interrupt my own voiceover here with another voiceover, and apologies if it sounds a lot different. We had this episode more or less finished, but just a couple days before it was scheduled to release, I was finally able to get in touch with the man that Elizabeth referenced in her note. His full name is Ben Homan, and he worked at Covenant from 1988 to 2000. Among other things, he told me about his interactions with Elizabeth and what may have precipitated her writing that note about him.
I mean, everybody knew each other and everybody knew Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was really good about forthrightly communicating her opinion. And, I remember her coming into my office and there was something, I can't even remember what it was, but there was something that was in the newsletter, and I was involved with editing the newsletter, that she didn't care for, and she told me about it. I thought, way to go, Elizabeth. You knew what was on her mind, and it was authentic, it was good, And from that standpoint, I really admired her coming all that way, obviously from Scotland, and then being able to hold forth and share her opinion. So I did not know her well. And, it's possible that we might have made mention in one of the newsletters about faculty moving from Covenant to Knox Theological Seminary, which was just starting. I mean, that was a brand new thing. And something I edited or wrote in the newsletter, Elizabeth didn't agree with, which is her prerogative, and it was fine. And I think it was good that she shared her opinion.
Were you aware at that time that she was going to Florida and that she was trying to take courses at Knox?
I'm not aware of anybody talking about it. And I don't recall talking to Elizabeth about that. My recollection is that Elizabeth, when she came into my office to, share her opinion, it was about something that I wrote or edited about the faculty transfers. And the fact that she was planning to go, that's actually new information to me, or at least I don't remember that. I mean, if anything, I'm now looking back, Knox was just beginning, it was unaccredited. Would I have advised any student to transfer or take classes from an unaccredited school that was just starting, regardless of the theological framework? I'm not sure I'd advise somebody to do that.
So with that context from Ben, Elizabeth's note makes sense. It was basically an inside joke based on a previous conversation they had had. And the timing's important here because Elizabeth's prayer request form says that she was hoping to take courses at Knox. So it seems like she hadn't yet been officially accepted there. And that may have been why not many people were aware that she was transferring, because she only found out herself a few days before she died. Okay, back to my original voiceover. Earlier, Ruth and I talked about Elizabeth being a complex person. Here she is, one of the only unmarried female students attending a theologically conservative seminary, despite what the Knox founders may have thought. And she's a strong-minded woman to boot. She says what she thinks, and frankly, she doesn't take shit from anyone. It might seem contradictory that she was looking forward to an even more conservative environment, but by all accounts, she was. Here's Jerem Bars, talking about the Knox split and Elizabeth transferring there.
That fight was basically over when I got here. A couple of the men who had been on the other side of that fight were still present, but they had basically been defeated and shut up. But they were still present teaching. But from my perspective coming in, it wasn't in the middle of the fight was over. And they were on the way out, and they both left a year after I arrived. I knew them both well because they had been professors when I was a student.
And so, we've talked about this before. You don't have to say it, but, and some of these people went and started Knox Seminary.
Yes.
We've already talked about it. But Elizabeth was going to Knox Seminary. So she was on that side of that battle.
I don't know. I don't know anything about that. I've heard that she was planning to move there. I didn't know that until 2 weeks ago. I had no idea she had those views, that she was attracted to the teaching of those two men. And I'm saddened if she was. One of them, I had avoided taking any classes with him at all when I was a student, back in the late 60s and early 70s, simply because I didn't trust him at all personally. Never did. And he was still here for a year when I came back. I still didn't trust him. Not because of his theological convictions, but personally. The other one had views on women, let's use that issue, which were very rigid and, from my perspective, profoundly unbiblical. And I can't imagine that Elizabeth would have been attracted to that, because she's a woman with very strong convictions. And he was a man who thought that women had no business really being theologically educated or involved in theological teaching. So I find it difficult to get my head around the idea that Elizabeth was attracted to going there. given who those two men were at Covenant, but who no longer had any powerful say either in our presbytery by that point, because they'd both tried to get all kinds of people dismissed from the presbytery for all sorts of things. And, they had been a problem at the seminary. And Paul Koischer, what I gather, this was before my time, was told, either you get this sorted out or we close the place down. And he got it sorted out. And Covenant started growing from that point, growing very rapidly from around the point when I arrived, not because I was there, but because this change had happened. And so a reform perspective, which was winsome and gracious, rather than rigid and critical, became dominant.
So with all that in mind, you did not get the impression from Elizabeth that she wasn't like argumentative about, oh, you're teaching this theology, that's wrong, this is the way that it should be done. Like, she didn't strike you as a person who would have been siding with the Knox contingent or was vocally antagonistic or anything like that.
I was astonished to hear it, because that's not where I'm coming from. But she never communicated anything critical or negative to me personally, or in class. We got on well. She treated me with respect, and I treated her with respect. But I was very surprised to hear that she was thinking of going there. I had no idea. That could have knocked me down with a feather. I'm not coming from where those guys were coming from, but not because I was in disagreement with them about most theological issues. It was more a matter of style and personal graciousness. And she may not have understood where they were coming from, because the one of them was ultra critical of Schaeffer. She wasn't. And the other was very negative really about women. And I can't imagine she was aware of that. The one of them, as I mentioned, the one who I didn't trust, I never had a class with him. I managed to avoid it, though he was teaching required classes when I was a student. But the reason I didn't trust him, and I can say this now, he's gone, but the reason I didn't trust him was when we arrived at Covenant, there were several of us who had been at L'Abri, either working at L'Abri in Switzerland or studying there. And, I didn't know where he was coming from, but we started having a prayer meeting every Monday evening. And we started having a discussion group every Saturday night, like a L'Abri discussion, asking non-Christian friends and just having open discussions and so on. It was out of those two things, basically, that Grace and Peace Church started. A year after I started at seminary, we started this church, which down in the city, which is still flourishing down there. But this professor invited us to his home to have our meeting there. And we took it as a mark of friendliness and respect and a real desire to find out. But in fact, there's no question he was spying on us. And from that point onwards, while he had the appearance of friendliness, he was very critical of Schaeffer in his approach to apologetics. Very, very critical. And he had really no idea what Schaeffer was teaching. But I heard him give a sermon in the church, one of the churches here in St. Louis, on Acts 17, on Paul on Mars Hill in Athens, in which he said, in the sermon, that what Paul did was wrong, was a mistake, and it was fruitless. Well, both of those things.
What?
Both of those things are nonsense. Luke tells us some people who are converted, but that's what he taught. He preached it in a sermon. I don't know if he taught it at the seminary, but I certainly heard him preached in the church. He really didn't like Schaeffer. It was very negative about him. So I can't imagine that Elizabeth actually knew that. And I can't imagine that she was aware that this other guy really had this very low view of women.
Here's Skip and Bonnie Dusenberry talking about Elizabeth transferring to Knox Seminary.
See, I don't remember that, but she may have done. And do you remember if she talked to you about that?
I vaguely remember that. I knew of it, and I think like the night before we took her back, the night before she died, she stayed after church, and I remember her talking to David Weinkopf, And I believe it was about that. I mean, that's the memory I have of us riding home from church, is that she was talking to David Weinkoff, because he would teach there. I think he was an adjunct.
Yeah, now I know he was an adjunct at Knox. I don't remember. I wasn't aware he'd been an adjunct at Covenant when you mentioned that. Certainly not during the 3 years that I was there.
But I think, several of the professors, Dr. Raymond was going, and Joseph Hall,
the librarian, Joe Hall,
and Dr. Knight, and David Weinkoff was going to be giving his team in there. It just seemed like a natural thing that, she would go there. That it wasn't a rancorous. Is that a right word?
Yeah, I think that's a good word. It was not rancorous, but again, back to her being strong-minded or whatever. I think she, certainly would have been considered conservative in the context as we would have been, and I think there was some perception that was part of the reason for establishing Knox over against Covenant. I don't know that it was explicitly over against Covenant, but just generally. And so I think that would have been part of the attraction for her perception. This was perhaps theologically, in some respects, a more conservative place. But that's based on my general read of her. I can't recall any specific, conversations about that.
Yeah, maybe she mentioned it in the car driving to church or something like that. It just wasn't a big deal.
I don't even have a vague memory.
And even her, she really didn't come across as bitter or angry or anything about leaving Covenant to go to Knox. And maybe it was because we had kids in the car most of the time when we were talking, but there were other times too that we would talk.
Yeah, I mean, she and I would talk on campus. Again, the one explicit conversation I remember was just that probably first one. She introduced herself, and we sat down and just kind of got to know each other a little bit initially. But that's why I wanted to qualify what I said about her being opinionated, strong-minded. I don't remember any time when she was, angry or bitter or anything. She had strong convictions, but I always remember her as being gracious, to everyone.
So it doesn't seem like Elizabeth was heading to Florida because she had specific issues with Covenant. Knox's more conservative views seem to align more with hers, and I think it's also very likely that a big part of her decision was her personal relationships with George Knight and Robert Raymond, and her pastor from Providence Church, David Weinkoff. And finally, circling back to Elizabeth wanting to be in a relationship, she told one friend from Providence that maybe she'd meet a man in Florida. There's another note about Elizabeth's academic record which we've never really heard anyone else talk about, and it sheds light on her interests and her willingness to work with people with different views. Here's Ruth.
We knew that Elizabeth was transferring temporarily from Covenant conservative school to Knox, a more conservative school. But in the process of reporting, we turned up something really interesting, which was that she had already been taking some classes at Eden Seminary. And you wouldn't necessarily know this unless you were in that world, but Eden is a liberal school, especially compared to Covenant and Knox. And so it turns out from looking through her diary and looking through some notes the police made that she had taken a few classes, including from somebody named Peggy Way, who was a pioneer really in how to educate women to go into ministry. And so we just thought it was super interesting that she was apparently very conservative theologically, but that she apparently enjoyed learning from other schools of thought too, and thought it was worth her time and worth her education to learn from other people. And that is, I would say, a little different than some ways that other people perceived her of being very, not really stick in the mud, but a little bit set in her ways, maybe, about her faith, when apparently she was willing to learn from other people too. And so I think that's worth considering as we think about her as a person.
Although it's interesting that you bring that up, because in the context of her taking this class, or the last class she was taking before she died, was called Theological Diagnosis. And there was a woman named Sally who was a classmate in there, and Sally told police that Elizabeth was her best friend in the class, and that Elizabeth was in good spirits and had been looking forward to traveling to Florida to go to Knox. And there's an interesting note in the police report that the last time that Elizabeth spoke to her sister, Helen, was just a couple weeks before the murder. And Elizabeth was telling Helen about this class at Eden and some problems that she was having. And it had to do with theological differences of some of the classmates that she had at Eden, which makes sense. Eden being a more liberal school, I'm sure she had some disagreements with them. And so even in that small context, it's like these people are really enjoying being around her. She's very passionate. They enjoy taking this class with her, but she's also kind of getting into it with them.
Yeah, that word problem is interesting. I've always wondered, like, is that just indicating, I've been debating a lot in class, or does it mean like my instructor is dinging me because I believe this? Or, I mean, there's no real way to know. A lot of these people aren't alive anymore. But you're right. It is interesting.
I think Peggy, the instructor, did tell police that she said, the quote is, Elizabeth was well-liked and participated a lot in class, demonstrating her deep faith. So it seemed to be at least mostly positive.
Well, and Elizabeth wasn't training to be a minister, remember? She was training to be a counselor. So I would imagine the stakes were a little different than if any of her classmates who were women were hoping to be ordained or hired to be a pastor or preacher in a church.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I hadn't even really thought about it till just now, but it's possible from what we've heard about the guys who went to start Knox Seminary and Elizabeth being more aligned with them, it's possible that some of those disagreements could have been over the ordination of women. I suspect that at Eden, that would have been more
100%
into that. So maybe she was arguing like, hey, we shouldn't be ordained. That's very possible.
I mean, and this would have been 15-ish years after the PCA became its own denomination, specifically over the ordination of women. So I'm sure it was a hot topic.
So hopefully that gives at least some small look into the question of who Elizabeth was. It's not a perfect picture, but it's enough to get a pretty good idea of how she operated in the world and how people experienced her. We've spent the last 5 episodes examining the details of the murder, some of the characters involved, and who Elizabeth was. You can think of it kind of like part 1 of this series. We'll come back to more of that later, but for now we want to shift the focus and examine the effects that Elizabeth's murder had on the Covenant community over the last 33 years, and how people in that community have felt about it. Next time. True Believer is written, recorded, edited, mixed, and executive produced by TJ Ingracia. Co-written and co-produced by Ruth Servin-Smith. Research and development by Kyle Hackman and Doug Servin. Visit truebelieverpodcast.com to see additional materials related to each episode, or to get in touch with us. If you're someone who knew Elizabeth, or have any information related to her or her murder, we'd love to hear from you. Next time on True Believer.
It still paints such an interesting picture when you understand the context of the PCA and what it means to be a woman in the PCA, especially a woman who attends seminary in the PCA or who feels called or interested or gifted for ministry. And
especially outspoken ones.
If God is this honest in the Bible about stuff, we need to be too. And so it's been a strange and disturbing reality that this has been kind of a dirty little secret that no one wants to talk about or acknowledge.
Covenant doesn't like to talk about it because it's never been solved. It's still an open wound that they don't like to scratch because it bleeds when it's open, and it's been scratched multiple times over the years.
That would be my word to colleagues that are out there that were around this situation. If you choose not to communicate about this, you're communicating. That's one of the reasons why I agreed to this interview is let's talk about it.